Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the University of Melbourne and to this ICT for Life Sciences Forum presentation. I'm Associate Professor Jan Tennant, the Chief Executive Officer of the Bio21 Cluster. The 21 members of the Bio21 Cluster represent some of Victoria's leading biomedical and health science research organisations. Tonight, the ICT for Life Sciences Forum is delighted to present this evening and to have as its guest speaker someone who is responsible for managing the nation's health and medical research budget. Currently, this budget stands at $690 million, but with last week's federal budget announcements, that amount is foreshadowed to grow to $860 million in 2014-2015. As many of you would be aware, health and medical research findings has been that the focus has been through a federal government review, the McKeon Review, which I'm sure many of you, like me, have as your bedside reading these days, entitled The Strategic Review of Health and Medical Research, Better Health Through Research, and this has been recently released to the public in April. Professor Warwick Anderson was appointed to the role of the Chief Executive of the National Health and Medical Research Council in June 2006. Prior to this, Warwick was the head of the School of Biomedical Sciences at Monash University, the Deputy Director of the Baker Medical Research Institute, and also held research fellowships at both the University of Sydney and the Harvard Medical School. Professor Anderson obtained his PhD from the University of Adelaide, where his research focused on the renal causes of hypertension, including the roles of renal vascular remodelling, renal innervation, and the renin-angiotensin system. By any measure, Professor Anderson's publication record of over 170 peer-reviewed articles is impressive. Professor Anderson is also a member of the Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council, a board member of the Global Alliance for Chronic Disease, a member of heads of international biomedical research organisations, and of the National Lead Clinicians Group. He is an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists of Australasia and an international fellow of the American Heart Foundation. In 2005, he was recognised with the award and having been made a member of the Order of Australia. Australia is recognised as internationally for the quality of our health and medical research. We have several Nobel laureates in medicine, and as a community we have pioneered many medical health systems that are the envy of many nations around the world. With advances in medicine and the consequent impact on costs, with growing physical pressures on governments here and elsewhere, the questions are sometimes about, are we being realistic in our expectations of funding for health and medical research to grow into the future, and for this funding that is available to continue to deliver the benefits for our community. Please join me in welcoming Professor Warwick Anderson to address this question and others this evening in his presentation entitled Who Benefits? A question about the future of health and medical research. Professor Anderson.
Thank you very much. I do want to talk about benefits tonight, and I want to start with financial benefits. The Sydney biotech company Cochlear in 2012 reported a total revenue of nearly $800 million, and it employs over 2,500 Australians. It was, of course, built on the research of Graham Clark, who did his important original research work while he was in his 30s. Colin Sullivan was even younger. He first tried positive airway pressure on a patient in his Sydney University laboratory, which eventually became the successful company ResMed, with a net revenue of $1.1 billion in just the 9 months of this financial year so far. Its market value is $8 billion. CSL was already a profitable company, but Gardasil helped it further. When it was introduced in 2007, CSL's reported earnings increased by 36%, or around $250 million. Ian Fraser too was in his 30s when he did the pivotal research leading to the cervical cancer vaccine, and his colleague Jian Zhu was even younger. So Australians can benefit and build innovative industries out of medical research. And it appears that being young might be one of the secrets here. Our recent Nobel Prize winners were also young. Peter Doherty, Barry Marshall, Robin is a little older, and Liz Blackburn were all in their 30s when they did their award-winning research. So I thought I might announce tonight, with my tongue in my cheek, that we're going to restrict NHMRC fellowships to people in their 30s from now on. I see a few fellows a bit older than that in the audience, so bad luck, Rob. Of course we won't, but I think it's a lesson always to remember that innovative ideas often do come early in people's career. These three companies have benefited, but we've all benefited as Australians from their economic activities, from their flow-on effects to other suppliers, from the taxes they've paid and the good jobs that they have generated. So let's think about who the investors are in medical research in Australia. It can be public or private. For example, Medicines Australia estimates that more than $600 million are invested by Big Pharma each year in clinical trials here in Australia. This is a graph from the McKeon review. It shows on your right that around about $6 billion for health and medical research in this country. 0.8 of that's from the NHMRC. It's from both public and private. And public investment eventually comes from the taxpayer, and our money certainly comes from the taxpayer via governments. Unlike some other countries, we have relatively small investment by charitable research funders here. Small but not insignificant. The Heart Foundation, the Cancer Councils and many others do play an important role, but in terms of quantum, quite lower than other countries. So I want to talk first about business and the private sector. Business benefits Australia through growth and profits, but we all benefit as well as individuals from their business. Medicines and pharmaceuticals are a success story in this country, with exports earning now more than either the wine industry or the car industry. It's probably a bit risky to mention the car industry in Victoria today. But as you can see, the biggest single manufactured export industry out of this country is a category of pharmaceuticals and biotech. I've already mentioned success of Cochlear, ResMed and CSL, possibly in the alternative order, but there's a much better story there which we're very poor at telling. I'm quoting now from AusBiotech. With respect to industry credentials, there are currently 100 stock market ASX listed life science companies with a market capitalisation of $40.7 billion. In a global context, the Australian biotech sector boasts the largest listed biotech sector as a proportion of GDP in the world. So here's a story that is a success, but we're poor at telling it. In fact, as this graph shows, the Australian Stock Exchange's Pharmaceutical, Biotech and Life Science Index has shown a 230% cumulative change since 2001 and certainly outperformed all ordinaries. We have money to fund health and medical research, so we don't do R&D, but some of you will know about our development grant, which is a proof of principle grant, and we recently reviewed these grants to see what they had delivered. You can read the independent report on our website. The reviewers looked at 40 specific grants in some detail, and here are the results. 80% had secured a commercial partner, 55% were currently under some form of commercial development, and 6 actually had a product to market or are awaiting regulatory approval. So this looks like success to me, and 2 points. The first is that NHMRC's peer review mechanisms may be better at picking winners than a typical venture capital firm, so open to offers. And secondly, there's a lot more potential here if this is the sort of pipeline that we are starting. Grants starting this year in our development grant scheme include technology for balance in the elderly, drug resistance TB, a malaria vaccine, bone scaffolding, lung imaging, ruptured eardrums, and detecting arterial plaques, amongst many others. But let me go back now to the public investment in health and medical research, because they too have expectations of benefit. The support for health and medical research through governments in Australia is provided by the community, and rightly in my view, they do expect to benefit from it, better treatments, better cures. You can think about the taxpayers' support of research as enlightened self-interest. So as the main investors, I guess the taxpayers should have the rights. So I didn't know what a taxpayer looked like, so I've shown you a picture of the Victorian taxpayers here. Researchers, of course, are beneficiaries too, although if you are a researcher in the audience, sometimes it mightn't feel like you're benefiting very much, especially if you're grappling with RGMS, sweating over your research plan while everybody's at the beach in January. But I think in our honest moments, we do admit there are benefits. You can pretty much run your own show after you escape from early career dilemmas. You can travel in a way that most other professions can't, as a postdoc or a sabbatical or to conferences. You make a wide range of international friends spread throughout the world, and something we find hard to admit to ourselves, I think, but it's a career which can give you great self-satisfaction that you're contributing to the improvement of the lot of your fellow human beings. So, who benefits? A longer list might read individuals, patients, the broader community, health policy makers, health administrators, health governments, the private sector, biotech companies, devices companies, the pharmaceutical industry, the universities, because they get great teachers and build their reputation, and researchers themselves. In fact, in short, everybody benefits from health and medical research. And Australian researchers have delivered these benefits over many years, not just a cure for sleep apnea, a short, sharp antibiotic treatment for gastritis, or a cervical cancer vaccine, but many others. We're about to have on our website a rotating little area on the website that's going to run through over 100 great Australian researchers who have really made significant contributions. Let me mention just a few. Metcalfe and cancer, Reader and the treatment of high blood pressure, Bishop and Holmes, rotavirus, Doherty, Ross River virus, that's the other Doherty, Coleman, von Eckstein and Laver and Relenza, Fiona Woods and Burns, and so on. It's a very, very long list. And I think personally we can be grateful. I'm really grateful that both my daughters are vaccinated with the Gardasil vaccine, and my elderly relatives, one of them, are very grateful to Colin Sullivan and the fact he could sleep without being awoke by his apnea. So it does become personal to us all. There are many other social, less tangible benefits. I don't know, I can't speak for you, but for me, having healthy grandparents, several generations around in our society, removing fear from the community about previously devastating diseases like polio, most of you are too young to remember that, and being able to offer more Australians more and better treatment for things they would otherwise suffer from for a lifetime, just makes a better society, a better place to live. Let's take stroke in women. In 1987, not that long ago, 74 deaths per 100,000 people, 100,000 women died from stroke. Instead of 74, in 2007 it was 37. That's good in all sorts of ways. Fewer deaths, fewer women, more women avoiding disabilities from stroke, and of course great for their families and their loved ones as well. And Australian hypertension research, I'm proud to say, has played its role in this outcome. I think Australians do understand the benefits from health and medical research, and in a recent Research Australia opinion poll, 95% of Australian voters overall thought that it was important for Australia to have a strong health and medical research industry, and a whole 51% felt it was extremely important, and another, 44% quite important. Interestingly, in the same survey, more than 90% of those surveyed believed that improving hospitals and healthcare was the #1 priority for the federal government. And of course, you can't improve hospitals and healthcare without health research. Now, some people say that providing healthcare is the second biggest industry in Australia after mining. The Australian government's health budget is almost $60 billion, and overall, and in the states, individual and private healthcare, it's around about $130 billion a year, a very large amount of money. So it's encouraging to me to see more researchers turning their attention to the type of research that policymakers themselves need to make the best decisions. Policymakers have hard decisions. They've always got to weigh up what's best to do, what's the platinum level of care versus the financial realities. In fact, if there's one thing I've learned since I've become a resident of Canberra, is that decision making in government is hard. It's always about choices that are hard. And in health, governments come under many pressures from groups through high emotion campaigns, and they really are hard for individual politicians to resist. I've got 3 examples now of how research can help the health budget, and I'm pleased to say they're all supported by the National Health and Medical Research Council. Rochelle Bookbinder and her colleagues at Cabrini showed in a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine that a therapy offered to people who had fractures of the bones of their spine was of no use at all. Didn't get them to recover more quickly and didn't reduce their pain, but certainly cost them a lot out of pocket, and you and me out of Medicare. In this very large program grant funded by the NHMRC, Jeff Braithwaite and Bill Runciman and colleagues showed that most patients in Australia did not receive appropriate care from their providers, appropriate being evidence-based. For example, too many referrals for MRIs for back pain against the evidence that it was useful. Most people with high lipid levels did not get primary preventive advice, and way too many people received antibiotics inappropriately. 2 more trials, this time by the Australian-New Zealand Intensive Care Clinical Trials Group. In 2004, they conducted the so-called SAFE study, which is a very simple study, compared the use of saline versus albumin in the intensive care unit, also published in the New England Journal of Medicine. On the basis of their findings that saline was at least as good as albumin, Access Economics then calculated that if the findings were implemented, there would be a net benefit of around $700 million a year. And another ANZICS clinical trial, this time of neurosurgical procedures for severe traumatic brain injury, found that if the findings of that trial were implemented, the changes in clinical practice should save the taxpayer more than $100 million annually. In other words, these 2 studies together, if implemented, would save around $800 million a year, and that's just about the same amount as the NHMRC has to spend on research, so it's quite neat. So at this point, I guess it's important also to note that research is not a panacea for the health system, and again, I'm grateful to the McKeon Review for this graph. if you look on the graph, it's health expenditure per capita on the x-axis and life expectancy on the y. And which country spends the most on research? The US, of course. Does the US get the most benefit in terms of life expectancy? Certainly not. Many countries to the left spend less on research but get a greater benefit. So it's not just about research, it's also about its implementation. Of course, the benefits some of the rest of us get as countries does come from research done by the United States, so we shouldn't be too ungrateful about this. So to have an effective health system, to restrain costs, to have a financially sustainable system, we'll need to use research more and more so we can make evidence-based policy decisions more readily. We do have some good evidence-based policy processes in Australia. PBAC and MSAC in particular, in Australia apply evidence in terms of getting new drugs or new procedures onto the public purse. And NHMRC itself, we publish evidence-based guidelines. They cost about $1 million each, which means that practitioners can know what evidence there is of what works best for patients. Evidence-based guidelines are probably the most difficult part of my job as the NHMRC, because whenever we republish the Australian alcohol drinking guidelines or Australia's dietary guidelines, it upsets all sorts of vested interests, and in the case of Australia's alcohol guideline, most men in Australia, it seems. So there is more potential here from research, and we're going to need it. This is also a graph from the McKeon review. If you read the percents across the bottom of that slide, you'll see that as a percent of GDP, health is anticipated to grow almost double, from 4% of GDP, or a quarter of government outlays at the moment, to around 7%, or half of government outlays, and that is clearly not viable. So we need a virtuous cycle. That's what Peter Wills told us 15 years or so ago, and this is our latest version. We need to make sure that when we do create knowledge, that we continue to support it, but that we work out how to translate that knowledge better into better prevention, healthy Australians, better treatments, new drugs and devices, better health care, the way the system works, and national wealth generation through new and innovative companies. There's one benefit I haven't mentioned yet, and I do it a bit carefully, I guess, because for some audiences, if there are a lot of people from the humanities, they might want to argue with this. But I believe that knowledge itself, just knowledge itself, is a benefit. It's after all the primary product created by research. What we do as researchers is initially just create new knowledge. But of course this knowledge is then used by others for the things I've mentioned earlier, new products, better and more efficient care delivery, and so on. The gaining of knowledge, I think, has been the distinguishing feature of our civilization, of the way that we've increasingly built successful societies, where we've chased away fear because we know that things have a logical cause and not a magical one. I'm very much looking forward to the advances in neuroscience, which are already, but will more in the past, demystify many of the mental health problems we currently have, the fear and loathing that it causes in victims and the community alike, that it's not something magical, there's a biological basis. But I think I mentioned civilization earlier. It's not a simple linear route between ignorance and knowledge, as the next two slides will show. It's alarming to read recently that vaccination rates are low in some Australian communities. The Australian vaccination network, as it shows on that slide, is actually the Australian Anti-Vaccination Network and is currently being, I don't know whether the word's prosecuted, but certainly the New South Wales Health Department is demanding that they change that website. The frightening thing about the recent vaccination survey was that there were two groups with low vaccination rates. One were the hippies of northern New South Wales, where I grew up, and not as a hippie, mind you, but you can probably tell. You know, they have deliberately forsaken modern society, so perhaps that's understandable, if not something one would support. But some of the lowest vaccination rates were in some of the richest suburbs in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide. So something in the march of civilisation is going wrong there. And in fact, how much harm was done by one shonky piece of clinical research 20 years ago now that claimed on the basis that we now know was misconduct, that childhood immunisation could cause autism. One piece of knowledge, one piece of research rather, now known to be false, continues to be taken up and promoted in spite of hundreds, thousands actually, of pieces of evidence that vaccination is safe, effective and socially equitable. So we've still got some way to go. And it's not just the fringes of society. Many of you will know this researcher. He gets NIH grants, who still believes that AIDS is not caused by HIV at all. And of course, in a disastrous consequence, the government of South Africa for some years, not now, believed he and his fellow travellers. So back to the taxpayers in companies in downtown Melbourne, but in that great spread of suburbs where people go about their daily lives and provide the money for health and medical research. What are their expectations? Well, they're actually fairly generous, but I do think they expect us to work on things that matter. You live in Melbourne. In Sydney, there's a paper called the Sunday Telegraph that at the moment is on a campaign to find frivolous sounding research and publicises as a waste of government money. So we do always have to remember that it is the public money and we shouldn't waste it. I think the public do understand that the benefits of research may be a long way off, and it's been my experience that the public does understand that basic research is very much needed. They understand, I think, that the most significant breakthroughs come from the least expected directions, from great scientists taking them where their instincts and their knowledge and training take them. But I think we can't lose sight that the money does come from the public. And for the NHMRC, not that far off $1 billion a year, which is a lot of money, and we are funded a scientific area relatively generously compared to other areas of research. And with that, I think, comes some responsibility. Our research is not about us, it's about them. So we need to work honestly and with high integrity so that the public can trust what we do and what we find. We have to work efficiently and use their money well. This is about expectations, and I thought I wouldn't mention the Melbourne Football Club supporters in this audience. Trust. If we are to continue to be supported by the public as researchers, we have to keep their trust. We need to make sure that we are vigilant and rigorous, ensuring that all our fellow researchers also know about the honesty and integrity that's central to research and work to the highest possible standards. And for all of us to infuse this ethos in our own work and workplaces. Central to this trust, and something we sometimes don't think about so much, is that the community allows us as scientists to make decisions ourselves on what to fund. In other words, to use peer review to decide on what to fund. And I want to come back to that in a moment. So the second part of my title is about the future and some of the challenges that it might face. And I'm not going to mention them all, but I want to talk about a few of them. The first is that research is becoming more complex, that we require more disciplines and a wider range of people and skills than we did. Complex problems do require collaboration, and most problems in biology and medicine are complex. There will, of course, always be a place for the brilliant researcher or a small team burrowing away in small groups. But it's a characteristic of research in the second decade of the 21st century that it's moving towards bigger teams and looser and more flexible groups. Some of the star researchers funded by the NHMRC have literally dozens of collaborators across a range of NHMRC grants. It's particularly true in public health and health services research, where our project grants even may have up to 10 chief investigators, 10 people who come together for this project but are on other projects separately. They bring their own skills to address the complex problems. Another remarkable feature, I think, is international collaboration now. We've learned a lot from the Human Genome Project, and public and private funders are increasingly cooperating to fund powerful new approaches to the big questions. Perhaps the best example of this is the International Cancer Genome Consortium, which now has a very, very well coordinated effort to document the genomics and transcriptomics of 50 of the world's most common cancers. With now 15 countries, including Australia, we're each funding our own researchers, but in an international coordinated way. And we are funding two teams, or a big team that are doing both pancreatic cancer, the most rapidly deadly cancer, and ovarian cancer, both in collaboration with, in one case, Canada, in the other case, the NIH. In Australia, institutional barriers can be a problem, and I think we are increasingly recognising that and overcoming. But ranking systems, such as the international university rankings and our own ERA, tend to lead administrators of our institution into protecting their own share of grants. And because of the uneven mechanisms of supporting the indirect costs of research in Australia, the problem gets aggravated. Another change that's sweeping health and medical research, indeed all research, is the move to open access. This is the move to make sure that the people who paid for the research, the community, have access to the results of the research and indeed increasingly to the data generated by the research. And that's a very welcome thing, although complex in implementing in many cases. So we and the other major funders of medical research have mandated that published research makes its way into the public domain as soon as possible, and certainly within a year, unless there are issues such as wishing to protect intellectual property, of course, that would get in the way of that. This open access publishing is turning scientific publishing world on its head with the rapid growth of journals that are instantly open access, and where their business model is that people who are submitting papers pay for the journal, pay for the cost of the journal. Another challenge is coming from researchers coming from a different direction, and it's back to this issue of peer review and about how we select grants to be funded. And at the heart of this issue is the issue of trust. Can we researchers can we be trusted by the public to make the decisions ourselves? In other words, to use peer review. And make no mistake, peer review is under attack. At the moment in the US House of Representatives, the chairman of the Science Committee, Lamar Smith, who's a Republican from Texas, has new draft legislation that would require a major change to peer review of grants in the National Science Foundation and require the director to certify that each funded grant has a direct benefit of either a direct economic benefit or a public health benefit. And the debate in the House, there are many louder voices than that about don't trust the scientists. Even here in this country, we've heard some Canberra voices, if I could put it that way, talk about, again, whether scientists can be trusted to do the right thing when selecting how to use the taxpayers' money. We can undermine public trust in peer review ourselves. Even here in Australia, there are some researchers saying that it's just too hard, let's run a lottery instead. I can think of few more core values in science than peer review. Yep, it's a lot of work. Perhaps it's the main time consumer of researchers other than applying for the grant itself. Don't mention RGMS. But by applying, you are asking, by that fact, others to review your work, and so it's kind of a mutual obligation. And yes, peer review is flawed, and yes, it doesn't give the same result every time. But the old dictum is right. Just as democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other forms, then peer review is the worst way to identify ideas and people to fund except for all the alternatives. So I think that there are lots of people, lots of scientists who hope there could be more certainty in peer review, that some fully quantitative metrics-driven process could be put in place. But there's a lot of social science research around this, and as one, Elizabeth Noel, has written, peer review is a social process, it's not a technical one. It differs from time to time and place to place. In other words, it's a human activity involving humans doing their best. The answer to problems with peer review, like problems with democracy, is to work to improve it, as we are trying to do at the NHMRC very actively now. So the answer is not to abandon this form of decision making, for in democracy to leave the decisions to a dictator instead of a parliamentary body, or in the case of peer review to a few grand old men or a government bureaucracy, tempting though that is, in the case of peer review. What about community involvement in deciding what to fund? If the public does provide funds through their taxes, what role do they have in deciding what to fund? We've long had a policy of consumer involvement in research, and all our committees have at least one community or consumer representative. The involvement of consumers directly in peer review is already a contentious issue, and it's one bound to grow over the coming time. There are some other challenges in Australia that I could take the whole time to talk about. One is women in science. For the NHMRC, women are about 60% of applicants for early career fellowships and 10% of applicants for our most senior fellowship. Women leave health and medical research. I think it was Mao who said women hold up half the sky, so we're throwing away one of the pillars, and we have an active process to work out how we can work to fix that. This is a characteristic of most professional areas, and it's not entirely fixable by the NHMRC, omnipotent though we often seem to be. It's something we'll have to do in partnership with the institutions that employ them. One other challenge that I often have to address with my good friends at the Department of Finance in Canberra is around the fact that we are actually only 3% of the world's health and medical research effort. So frankly, most of the benefits to Australians from research will actually come from overseas. So there are three ways to think about this. There's the deep in the bowels of the Department of Finance way, and that is, let's not do any research here, let's just import it all. So, not a good idea. We wouldn't have Ian Fraser, Colin Sullivan or Graham Clark or all the companies that they have built. Of course, we wouldn't have the people here who can gather up all that international research. The only people who can really translate research at the first step are other researchers who know the world literature, know how to interpret it and provide advice locally. Every day, state, territory and Commonwealth health departments, road traffic authorities, NGOs, medical students, allied health students, all rely on research-trained people to either teach or do research or give them advice. What about instead of trying to do everything, we just do a couple of areas, but do much more in those areas? This is a very common argument. So let's say the NHMRC Council decided that it was going to put all its effort into two really big issues for Australia. The first being cancer and the second mental health. We'll put all our research funds into those areas. And before the cancer and mental health researchers in the audience start licking their lips, I don't think it's going to happen, but this certainly would divert a lot of research to these areas. So let's say cancer research might go to $550 million a year, up from 186 this year, and mental health to 300 million, say, up from 62 million a year. But think of the downside. We wouldn't do any funding in all the other areas, health and ill health. And so we just have the same don't do the research here problem that I discussed earlier. And again, no research-trained people to do all the things we require research-trained people to do in our country. I suppose even more cogently from my point of view, even if we funded cancer research at $550 million a year in Australia, that would still be way less than 10% of the total worldwide cancer research funding, so it still would be a relatively small amount. 90% would happen elsewhere, and we would have damaged our translation, care, policy, teaching and all the other benefits in all the other areas. And perhaps even worse, the extra funded grants, many of them would be lower quality. My staff worked out that that would allow us to fund all the cancer applications down to the bottom of Category 4 and all the mental health grants down to the bottom of Category 1, and there'd be some left over. So you can see very unlikely to get benefit from those extra grants because we wouldn't be funding truly excellent work elsewhere. So my view has always been we should stick to funding the best ideas and the best people and the most able researchers with an eye to future capacity building and promoting translation. To do else is wasteful of the taxpayers' money, and to abandon research in most areas of research of health for Australian would be, I think, really unthinkable. We must defend the left field idea. If it's rated highly by peers, then we should take a punt on it. Always hard for a government funding body to do that. And so I've introduced the Marshall and Warren Award, which we ask our grant review panels at every grant to think about whether this is a Marshall and Warren Award winner. In other words, something that's highly innovative and potentially transforming and a bit risky, and we award one each year. Mind you, we also have a specific category and our 3 criteria that does also score for innovativeness. So, my final point is back to the argument that the benefits of research could be realised much more quickly. This is a cartoon in our current strategic plan, and it's modified by the artist from one that was originally in Nature in 2008. For society to benefit fully from research, better care, treatment, better prevention, we must build a better bridge across that gap. We have to pay in our health system and provide care more and more on the basis of what works, what's known from research. If we could do that, much waste would be eliminated. And yes, we hear so often that new therapies are costly, but they're often really good. And so we have to make sure that we stop funding those other therapies, processes, procedures, treatments of care that aren't so cost effective, and effective, of course, relies on knowing that from research. I think the biggest opportunity over coming years is stopping paying for old processes, procedures, pharmaceuticals, therapies where there is no evidence-based. Again, this is a very nice graph from the McKeon review that talks about costs of things versus the cumulative health benefit. And as we go up towards the flat part of that curve, there's always a very strong decision that has to be made, no matter what the emotional appeal. This is just not worth it to the taxpayer, and of course some things get you on the downward slope. They're usually byproducts. If you follow the Obamacare debate in the United States, some of you might have picked up some of the more extreme comments about the US and Australia, the UK and Australia, having these death committees. The death committee in Australia turned out to be the TGA and PBAC. In other words, they made rational decisions based on evidence not to provide public support for some new agents. And there lies the story and difference of costs between the US and the UK and here. These are hard decisions about what not to do, but they can be made with strong and resolute decision making. So, for example, in private health insurance, you and I pay for many complementary and alternative medicines that are used by others, and they appear not to have an evidence base for effectiveness, or at least not greater than placebo. And why do you do that? Because the taxpayer provides subsidies for private health insurance, estimated to be around $5 billion, so not a small amount. So last year, Minister Plibersek asked that the evidence for the effectiveness of a number of alternative therapies, natural therapies, be provided, or she would move that they no longer be subsidised by the taxpayer, by government. And we at the NHMRC are working with the Department of Health on that evidence. The diagram that's back up there shows a simple bridge across this gulf, the gulf between discovery and its implementation by a practitioner, or of course also by a policymaker. The gap is wider than that. If it was just a matter of repairing that bridge, things would be simple. There are many factors at play, of course, but we can really help as researchers by bringing the research lens over everything that happens in the health system to make sure that it's rational and it's based on evidence. I'll keep this talk for Sydney, but I think instead of that rickety bridge that looks from something like the Temple of Doom movie, let's see if we can build a proper bridge. It's going to take a long time, but this is really one of the most urgent priorities, I think, for health and medical research. If we have researchers on one side and people on the other side providing care or providing policy, we've got to somehow bring those two groups together. And so we've introduced at NHMRC these partnerships for better health grants, where a research need organisation, a government department, an NGO, a private sector body, can work with researchers to bring a bid to the NHMRC to lever their funding up. And we have a very wide range of funding partners, 141 unique partners with the grant, with these grants that have been running about 3 years. These grants too now are always open. You can apply any time for a partnership project grant. And by looking at that list, you'll see there's quite a large number of different types of organisations. And then the last couple of words. None of this that I've talked about matters at all if Australian health and medical research is not up to scratch? Why would the investor put the money in if it was second rate? Well, there are many ways of measuring the quality of health and medical research, and this is kind of the easiest way, and of course there's only one way. But this is from our most recently published independent bibliometric survey of the performance of Australian health and medical research as measured by citations in the ISI database. And I've just picked out one statistic here. This is the top 1% cited papers internationally, so the top 1% of the worldwide. And as you can see, NHMRC funded research, 2.8%, almost 3% of the papers from our funded research are in the top 1%, and for Australia overall, it's 1.8%. So just one parameter, but as you can see, I think really strong evidence that Australian health and medical research is exceptionally strong. So I hope I've convinced you that health and medical research has delivered many financial, many health and many social benefits to Australia, but there's much to be done. Only when we all live healthy, long lives, our health system is affordable and treats every patient on the basis of evidence, and Australia has a biotech industry to rival mining, can we as researchers rest on our laurels? It's not in sight yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that tremendously comprehensive presentation and most interesting. Not only did you provide us with many examples of the benefits of health and medical research that I'm sure will have resonated with all of us, both with our research and our general public hat on tonight. But you also filled in the colours, some bright and some murky, in that landscape against which the decisions about current and future research funding will be made. And it's of course that landscape that surrounds the bridge between the discoveries and the health outcomes and policy. Just absolutely in winding up, I need to thank the sponsors, the many sponsors that help bring the ICT Life Sciences Forum to you. Their generous support is greatly appreciated, and they're all listed behind me. Finally, just in closing, if you would all join with me once again in showing our appreciation for Warwick's presentation.
Thank you very much.